Hello. Welcome to Saber What Ifs, where you can get your daily dose of what if content. If you enjoy this video, make sure subscribe and like this video to motivate me to make more. Without further ado, let's get into this fanfic. Chapter 1, A New Beginning to the End. I do not own Fate/Stay Night, nor this fanfiction. Emiya Kiritsugu was a man whose life could not be simply told. If one were to see him today, they would see a tired-looking male in his early 30s who seemed to be trying to enjoy everything around him with a tired smile. He was a failure as a chef. He traveled a fair bit. He was fairly knowledgeable about military tactics and firearms. But most of all he enjoyed spending time with his son Shirou. The boy was not his own from what he told others, however the two got along so well that it did not really matter. If one were to see him 3 years ago, they would have seen a cold calculating man. Emotionless, efficient, precise, ruthless, it would not be far from the truth to call him a monster in some ways. He weighed all lives on the scale of necessity, taking all into consideration and always tipping it so that the least amount of lives was lost. In doing so, however, he paved a path of blood for himself that few could hope to match. A master of subterfuge and war tactics, and a practitioner of thaumaturgy, otherwise known as magic, Emiya Kiritsugu was a magus, and there was a reason why he was once known as the infamous Magus Killer. However, that was before the ending of the Fourth Holy Grail War, before he rescued young Shirou from the verge of death and adopted him, before he was cursed by the corrupted Holy Grail and the spirit of Ngramai that dwelled within it, before he lost his wife and sacrificed any chance of seeing his real daughter again. It had been 3 years since the war. In the span of 2 weeks he had played the ultimate game against 12 other individuals paired up like himself and his temporary familiar saber. The enigmatic king of conquers who desired to rule all, the mysterious and pompous Golden King who claimed to own all, an insane cultist who sacrificed children and women for his own sick rituals and curiosities, contemptuous magi who participated only for glory, the noble dual spear-wielding knight, the empty priest who gained pleasure only from the misery and suffering of others. It was a secret free for all war that left blood everywhere. He himself had had a hand in ending several of the other participants, and at one point had even destroyed an entire skyscraper in a failed attempt to kill the Master of Lancer. And yet at the end of that secret contest that claimed so many lives in the process, the only result was more lost lives as at the last second, immersed in the corrupted gelatinous liquid that spewed forth from the Grail and clinging onto his sanity and body as both were torn apart from the magical sludge, Kiritsugu saw what had truly become of their goal and the result of any wish that was made using it. He forced his summoned partner, the King of Knights, the legendary King Arthur, who happened to actually be a girl named Arturia and unaware of what had become of her prize, to destroy the Grail in order to prevent the artifact from potentially causing mass genocide. Its original purpose, to grant the wish of the winning master and servant of the Grail War, was disclosed to him to have been the ultimate monkey's paw, in that the now corrupted item now granted the wish in the form of absolute destruction. Utilizing it to open the gate to Akashic records, the swirl of the root, the source of all that has been and all possibilities, the goal of almost all who studied thaumaturgy, as well as realizing the third great magic, were all meaningless to him. He had only participated because he had been hired to, and so he could have his wish granted, to have a world of peace without violence. A world where he would no longer have to sacrifice the innocent in order to save the masses. He was tired of knowing that in order to save the many, the few had to be forfeited. He could still see the memories in his dreams on occasion. Waiting for his father, who had condemned an entire island's worth of people to death for his experiments, to turn his back on him so trustingly, and pointing the gun at the man's head. He was only a child at that point in time. Talking to the woman who he considered his mother, who taught him everything he knew about hunting ceiling designates and other targets, about pretty much everything after his father's death, flying the plane filled with 300 dead apostles above his head as he sat in an unmarked boat in New York, before using a rocket launcher and killing everyone on board, watching as his final order to Saber aka Arturia destroyed the corrupted Grail and caused a chain reaction that for lack of a better term nuked an enormous section of Fuyuki City, where he was living now, killing over 500 innocent people in the area in the process. Stumbling through the inferno that he caused, looking at all the people that he had murdered, and crying tears of joy as he found that single solitary boy still barely alive, glad that he could save even just that single life from that accursed hell. In a way he himself was rescued by the boy. It was really the first time he had actually saved anyone in his life. Before, all he had done was kill people in order to preserve the lives of the many, however he had never truly gone out of his way to rescue an innocent. Mia would have counted if it weren't for the fact that she was not innocent at all. A guerrilla fighter raised at a young age, she became an assistant to his chaos since she was unable to do anything else with her life, until she was killed by Berserker in an attempt to protect Irisveal, the homunculus, the living core of that war's holy grail, his wife. The man sighed as he drank tea on the porch of his home and watched as Shirou stopped attempting magic for the night and went to bed. What would you say in this situation? He had told Shirou about him being a magus about a year back, and since then against his advice he had been teaching the boy the science of thaumaturgy. Well, he couldn't say that really. The boy's progress was nearly non-existent. He could barely get any spells to work even though he seemingly possessed an above-average magic circuit. The best the boy could do was gradation air, aka projection, and reinforcing. The former, being the ability to create objects from pure prana, was nearly useless in the eyes of the magic world due to the fact that it was inefficient compared to finding and utilizing the original object, and the latter, the ability to enhance a base purpose to its fullest, such as making food more nutritious or making sticks harder, was too unstable and uncertain for him to attempt right off the bat. He did seem to have a knack for structural grasp magecraft as well, the skill that enables the user to analyze the contents, structure, and purpose of the object he focused on, but that too was nearly useless as other than gaining the user basic information it did literally nothing. Still, it seemed to be all he was capable of doing at the moment. Shirou seemed to have no affinity for the basic 5 elements, and it was near impossible for him in his current state to find out what the boy's origin was. Hell, it would have been unlikely to have found it out when he was in top condition. The magus killer stared at the moon silently, his empty teacup sitting next to him and the summer moon glowing in the distance, the local insects making for a rather soothing lullaby despite the hard location he was resting. He did not know what time it was at that point, nor for how long he had been sitting there, nor did he care. For not the first or last time the man felt his consciousness fading away in that sitting position, letting his deteriorating body's exhaustion once again get the better of him as he fell into a deep sleep. Gi Bo? I ask. R, Master? X, Br. The images and voice slowly fogged his mind as if he was barely watching several movies at once and half the scenes were out of order. The actors and effects barely registering as he switched from one scene to another. However, as he continued to watch with increasing interest, the voices and images gradually cleared. Sakura. Happened to you? Ave to keep her away from Zoken, otherwise he'll just use her and cause more damage. The temple. We have to stop him before he completes the ritual. Trace, on. Less battles, meaningless war, meaningless happiness. This isn't what I became a hero for. OT. You've been making your nervous system into makeshift circuits every time you used magic? Do you even know how to use the circuits you already have? Or should have been the one to survive? At least he knew how the world worked and wasn't a fool, even if he was a faker like you. No, even in his dreams, this was too real, it couldn't be possible. He had made sure that the ley lines of prana in the area would be destroyed in the next 40 years. 20 years before the next war should start, but then how is he still here? I am the bone of my sword. Hello Oni-chan, it's nice to finally meet you in person. Berserker. Rejoice young man, your wish will finally be granted. Kiritsugu's eyes flashed open. The scene he had closed his eyes to had been replaced with a morning environment, complete with condensation all over the area and birds chirping in the distance. He barely registered the fact that the morning sun was looming over the horizon or the fact that his aching body was even more ailing than usual from the spot he had fallen asleep in. "Old man, you fell asleep outside again." Shirou's voice enabled Kiritsugu to further himself from his daze. "I'm barely 32, Shirou." The man sighed as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes before looking at the boy with a small wry grin. The red-headed 10-year-old was already in his day clothes and had his apron on. "I take it you already made breakfast." "Well, you and Fujine aren't." The boy puffed out his cheeks immaturely. "I've had enough fires in my life." The magus killer snorted at that comment. While the inferno he inadvertently created was indeed a horrible event, Shirou's experience with flames didn't end there, as the kitchen had been the location of at least 8 fires since the boy moved in, though most of them were during a period of time when the local daughter of one of the local yakuza attempted to learn how to cook in their humble abode. To hear the boy retell the story was almost as if he had gone through a Holy Grail war each time. Luckily though, despite the age difference, the teen and the boy got along just like siblings, which was relieving for Kiritsugu. He had no doubt that when he did die in the near future that Fuji's family would handle his property and take care of Shirou in his stead. It also helped that they were very willing to buy the firearms and ammo he still had on him left over from the Fourth War. After the Einsburns cut him off shortly after his betrayal, he was left with only the small accounts that he had always hidden, just in case, which was enough to sustain the two and pay the taxes, but he did want some extra cash to blow every now and then. He still kept his Thompson contender though, leaving a mystic code in the hands of the yakuza. He was dying soon, but he wasn't stupid. "You and me both, kid." He laughed. "Do you have anything planned for today?" "Not really." The boy shrugged. "I was just planning on coming back home and doing some more magic studying. I think I'm getting the hang of my circuits now. It's getting easier for me to focus through getting my circuit to work." Kiritsugu paused for a moment, letting the boy's words ring through his mind for several seconds. His dream was already fading away, however what Shirou said had caused one part to stick out barely. "Shirou?" the man asked carefully. "Tell me again how you are using your circuits." The boy looked at him curiously. "Huh? I just calm down, take deep breaths and make my circuit. It hurts a lot, like sticking something hot and long down my back, but like I said, I'm getting used to it now. I'm not going to complain." He blinked before edging away from his father. "Old man? Did I do something wrong?" Kiritsugu said nothing as he thought about his dream, or what he could remember of it anyways. The scenes that were brought up were far too familiar to be a mere coincidence, and it terrified him to be perfectly honest. Another war, another massacre, despite his efforts to put an end to it all, it would still continue. His dreams, they were both a blessing and a curse to the man because he knew he would die soon. He was virtually powerless. "Dad?" Shirou asked again. "Why are you mad?" "I promise I won't do whatever it is again, please." Kiritsugu took a moment to try and understand what the boy was talking about when he realized the feeling in his face. He could feel it being hard, emotionless. He was back in the persona he had thought he had discarded when he had rescued the boy those years ago. Calming himself down, the cursed man relaxed his features. It wouldn't do to get excited just yet. From what he remembered from the dreams, Shirou still had time to prepare for everything. "Sorry. I was just beating myself up for missing something like this." He laughed. "I'm glad I caught it though. Before you go to school, Shirou, let's just quickly go over how you are supposed to access your circuit." Oh. Some hours later. Kiritsugu was sitting in his living room making a list of anything he could remember from the dream he had. Despite how much he knew he had seen, the list was rather pathetic. It was a shame that Shirou was only now barely starting to get the hang of using magic. He was fairly certain he remembered a spell that could be used to recall information from dreams. He shook his head. "No. Even then, to learn even one spell for most magai took at least a few weeks to do, and he was fairly certain that a dream-watching spell would not make it to his curriculum even if he was a halfway competent teacher, which he was not. So far he could only mostly remember basic things, such as the vague color of some of the servants he saw, the color of their weapons, some of their voices, etc. etc. However, there were other things he remembered that were unervingly specific. For example, he knew that the archer from his war was still alive and would most likely play some role in the next war. The thought of the servant's presence unnerved him. The monster possessed far more noble phantasms, relics and weapons that symbolized and represented the power of heroic spirits, than anyone thought possible. He also knew that Shirou was definitely involved in the oncoming war. The boy's red hair and stubborn personality was impossible to mistaken for anything else. Thank the root, he had actually managed to fix his bad habit of turning his nerves into makeshift circuits. Otherwise, the only way the boy would manage to survive the oncoming battles was either by pure dumb luck or if heaven forbid one of the other masters took pity on him, which seems to have happened according to his dreams. Ugh, this entire debacle was already giving him a headache. Prophecies and visions of the future weren't unheard of. Far from it, however, they either tended to occur within people that happened to have magic circuits that were designed to tap into the root, or when the individual established some sort of bond with a significantly powerful magical source. Random flashes, on the other hand, were borderline impossible, especially if he was watching multiple possibilities of the same event, or at least he assumed so. Kiritsugu was not like most magus in the fact that he focused his studies more on the application of magic to get things done, treating it more like a tool, whereas most preferred to take on a scholarly approach and immerse themselves in research and try to learn and discover as much as possible, by almost any means possible. He shook his head to clear his thoughts. It was pointless to think about other magi now. The only ones he had had a decent relationship with were the Einsburns, and he blew up that bond when he blew up the Grail. If he did show up at the clock tower in England, he would need a damned good excuse for being there. Asians were not well received, and that went double for freelancers, of which he once was practically the king of at one point. Unless he kept his visit low-key, he would no doubt encounter some relative of a magi that he had killed back in his prime. Though if he negotiated some kind of deal, he did have some tricks for breaking through bounded fields and combat tactics that he was fairly certain at least some of the pretentious pricks in the organization might be interested enough in to cut him some slack. He had enough experience with the Einsburns when he was married to Iri for 9 years to talk the noble talk at least. Looking once more at the list, he glanced down at the last thing he had managed to deduce from his dreams. Shirou was constantly fighting in them, however the method he fought was almost always the same. Somehow, the boy had managed to come up with a form of projection that far surpassed everything that he thought was possible. He seemed to be at his strongest when fighting with 2 swords, the Thinks, or maybe it was that red arm. Regardless, projection was not as useless as it had originally seemed to the boy. After what seemed like hours to the man mulling over everything he had written down, Kiritsugu put down his pen and slowly took the paper to his room. His old Japanese-style home was fairly large. However, he took his time moving from one room to the other, enjoying the spring afternoon to the fullest. Should he have more dreams, he would want it nearby to write more information as soon as possible. How many timelines was he watching? What were the abilities of the fighters? How had Archer lasted so long? These were questions he prayed he could answer soon, not for himself but for Shirou. For the boy he had rescued from what seemed like hell itself, who did not know that he was in the care of the man that was responsible for destroying his past life. For the boy who did not know what trials and horrors were waiting for him many years from now. Kiritsugu's eyes narrowed once more, donning a face he had once more assumed he had forgotten the shape of. He had found salvation in this boy and he had rescued him. The man was powerless, and he would die long before the oncoming events. However, that did not mean he would not do anything to affect those events. Very slowly, the Magus killer began to formulate his next steps. Chapter 2, Foundation. He dreamed of that man again that night. The man that he condemned with his childish dreams moments before his own death. He watched that man's story once more unfold before him. Growing up stern and tall, faithfully following the dreams that he inherited from his father without question. He watched as the man, as a teen, fought and learned, pushing his way forward to help others without asking for anything in return. His friends and loved ones, who could not see things the way he did, abandoned him as time went on, but he did not falter, forging his path to become a hero, helping and saving everyone that was within his sight, not once truly valuing himself. Was it so wrong? The man often thought to himself as people distanced themselves from him. No, there is nothing wrong about wanting to help others. Yet before long he was alone. His selfless deeds were deemed too suspicious by the world. Surely a man who constantly put himself in such danger so frequently had some agenda. No sane man would be that selfless, but the Watcher and the dreaming hero both knew that he was, for the hero in this story was an empty human. He could find no sense of happiness from within. His only joy came from helping others. So much was his love that the man had, after arriving at the scene of destruction that could only have been caused by some sick accident, made a deal with Aleya, the spirit of humanity. In return for becoming a counter-guardian and protecting the planet after his death, the lives of the 100-odd victims would be saved and restored. If only he had known what he had truly condemned himself to at that time, for counter-guardians were mere clean-up spirits, summoned when the Earth was on the verge of destruction and required a massive overwhelming force in order to counteract the threat. They were the cure. And humans were often the disease. Time and time again, after he was betrayed and murdered by one of the people he saved and put to death, the man's spirit was called to commit genocide against humanity. Guilty and innocent, man, woman, and child, so long as they were somehow involved, all who came across him were eventually put down in order to somehow protect humanity as a whole. He could not control his actions, for his spirit now belonged to Gaia. All he could do was watch as his beliefs slowly eroded away, washed in the blood of those he had murdered, until he became cold and bitter, desperate to escape the hell that he had condemned himself to unknowingly. Despite the fact that the odds of it happening were borderline non-existent, he deduced the only possible way to save himself. Kiritsugu woke up to Shirou constantly nudging him with his foot. "Come on, wake up already, old man. I need someone to calm Fujine down while I cook." The boy sighed. I'm up. Kiritsugu grunted as he slowly picked himself up. "Taiga's here already?" The boy pouted. "Already? She got here late, if anything. You slept in again. For good reason too." The man mentally commented as he rubbed his eyes. "I see. I'll be out in a moment, just go ahead." The boy sighed before walking outside the room again. "Please hurry up, Dad, you know how Fujine gets when she's hungry and bored. Don't tempt me to take longer, Shirou." The father laughed lightly as he waited for Shirou to get far enough away for him to do his next few tasks in private. When the coast was clear, Kiritsugu reached for the notebook, which had evolved from that single piece of paper, from underneath one of the tatami mats in his room. It had been 3 weeks since the dream started, and even though they occurred roughly every 2 to 4 nights, the man had already discovered and deduced an extremely significant amount of information. He determined that he was watching roughly 4 different potential routes of the Fifth War. The first 3 were focused from Shirou's perspective, though on occasion he saw possible decisions or actions made in those 3 routes that ended in his son's rather unpleasant demise. It was fairly amusing and disturbing to him when he realized that each of these 3 routes involved the boy getting familiar with a different female, especially when he realized that one was his old servant Saber, and the other 2 were the daughters of Tosaka. He could dwell on his son's potential love life later. The 4th route, however, intrigued and terrified the man to no end. It did not cover the time of the war itself, but what happened afterwards. After this night's previous dream, he had no doubt that the enigmatic archer of the new war was indeed a potential future of the boy he was taking care of. A counter-guardian with the potential to be a heroic spirit in this day and age where heroic spirits were all but an impossibility, he didn't know whether to cry for joy or for remorse at what his son had become. To possess so much potential. He shook his head as he continued to write his notes down. He had after a few dreams managed to train himself somehow into retaining all the random information he got while sleeping, and the results were not disappointing in the least. He now knew how to train Shirou when it came to his offensive magic, and he learned a few other things about the boy in the process as well. His future method of projection and analyzing the structure of objects. Tracing, was in his own words absurd and brilliant. Because in his dreams the boy had focused on nothing but training in structural grasp and reinforcement for so long, he had developed his own advanced form of projection that was borderline sorcery if a real magus actually took the time to look at it. Being able to make borderline perfect copies just by looking at the original. Other than Shirou's immediate combat potential, Kiritsugu learned some other things as well. Shirou's origin and element, for example, were both sword, which probably explains all the sword fighting and creating he had seen, yet he was unnaturally skilled in archery as well. He had made a mental note to have the boy train in both as soon as he could, preferably using Taiga as his trainer when it came to the bladed weapons. The girl was downright relentless. Shirou also had a surprisingly strong sensitivity for nearby magic. Most mages experienced this sixth sense by substituting it into one of their basic 5 senses in a way, most commonly by touch or by sight. Shirou on the other hand was able to smell nearby sources of prana to such a degree that Kiritsugu had on more than one occasion claimed the boy was part dog. The assassin was already thinking of training methods he could use to enhance the boy's skill with his senses in order to work with it more efficiently and quickly in times of danger. In the meantime though, Kiritsugu had decided for the boy to focus on his strongest basic which while initially useless, enabled the boy in the future to use his greatest strengths, tracing. Time and time again he made the boy scan and analyze random objects to see how they worked. Washing machines, chairs, beams, computers, food. Every time he told the boy to look for their purpose and what they went through. For objects that had mechanical and electrical components, he told the boy to see how they worked and look for the parts that were wrong, even for the things that the child clearly had no idea on how they functioned or what their purpose was. These objects worked best for the boy's training since they had the most complicated internal properties, components, and purposes compared to others. The boy was getting better with each passing day. He was no genius, far from it. However, it was simply as if Shirou had been trying to figure out how to do those things in the first place and Kiritsugu was pointing him in the right direction. This was after all, the only spell the child could perform before he found out he had been making his circuits wrong after all, so there was of course some proficiency shown in the spell already. The magus killer was not a scientist by any means. However, he did manage to scrape up a theory as to how Shirou managed to obtain the ability to copy any close-ranged weapon he desired near perfectly just by looking at it. It had, in part, have to do with his other self not knowing how to use his magic circuit. By limiting himself only to tracing and grasping the structure and properties of everyday items for almost 10 years, the boy had enhanced his ability to perceive and analyze physical objects to inhumane levels, going beyond the physical and enabling him to grasp history as well as intentional and mystical purposes and processes just as easily. While this alone was not truly something to brag about to the clock tower, when combined with his element and origin of sword, an unexpected phenomenon occurred at some point. Said phenomenon was that the boy somehow manages to subconsciously trace and store the data of anything that can fall even vaguely under the category of sword without using any prana at all. This included axes, lances, pretty much any sort of short-ranged weapon. His dreams indicated that barriers and shield-like tools could be recreated as well, but at a higher cost. The boy could also trace other objects as well, including somewhat complicated ones like flashlights and television remotes, however they did not come as natural to him as say a kitchen knife. And taken to its highest level, the boy would eventually be able to produce something that has only been done by humans a total of 6 times in recorded magi history. He would be able to create a bounded field that reflected his inner world. temporarily overriding the natural world around him and turning the land around him into the ultimate tool, a reality marble. Unlimited blade works it was called. An endless empty field devoid of life save for those who were drawn into it. The sky was littered with immeasurably huge gyrating gears, and the field was likewise littered with all the weapons jutting up like tombstones that Shirou had witnessed through his life and stored here. The only distinctive landmark was a small hill covered in blades. Even if Kiritsugu didn't train himself in keeping his memories from his dreams, he would definitely remember that image. Faker. That was what Gilgamesh, the golden servant that had caused him so many problems the previous war, had called both Shirou and Archer, and that was what Kiritsugu intended to train his son to be, the perfect weapon against the king of heroes. Putting his pen and paper away, Kiritsugu put off his planning again to eat some breakfast with the makeshift family he had inadvertently made these past few years. He came into the dining room to see the teenaged Taiga gorging herself on the food his son had made with a burning passion. One just meeting the girl would never assume that she was actually the daughter of the local Yakuza bosses, and his neighbor. Calm down, Taiga-chan. The food isn't going anywhere and you're already late for school. The reason why Shirou wasn't in a rush was simply because he was still in primary school, and as such classes started a bit later than high schools so that all the schools could share the same buses. Ugh. The girl grunted through a full mouth. But ahuha. Words and sentences, Taiga-chan. The man shook his head as he knelt down to the old-fashioned table and began to serve himself. Perhaps cooking had something to do with Shirou's tracing ability as well. After all, it also possessed the process of taking basic components and turning them into something completely different. All the man knew was that Shirou's cooking had steadily been improving for some reason after his training originally started. Breakfast was no exception. The girl attempted to swallow a few times, bordering on full-blown choking before the food went down before her mouth was empty. I'm hungry, Ruga-kun. She moaned with teary eyes, calling Kiritsugu by the affectionate nickname she had given him. I missed dinner yesterday 'cause I was out all night training for the kendo tournament this weekend. You probably won't even fight though. Shirou added in a matter-of-fact tone. You keep on forgetting to take off that pendant off the bottom of your sword. Every time you try to enter, you get disqualified for it. Said pendant the boy was referring to was a small pendant hanging off the pommel of the girl's kendo sword. Doing so was illegal in tournaments since it was disrespectful to the opponent. Still, it didn't do anything to the girl's form and technique when she beat the living daylights out of her opponents in matches that she did manage to get in. Shirou had mentioned at one point or another that her sword seemed to have an unnatural bloodlust deep inside of it. Perhaps once the boy was no longer scared stiff of the sight of the thing, he could convince the redhead to trace it to the point that said bloodlust is recreated as well. What was that brat? Taiga roared in blind immature rage as she crawled over to where the boy was rapidly and put him into a headlock. Now Taiga-chan. Kiritsugu laughed. Deep down he ached, wishing deeply his real daughter was here with him to experience this sort of environment. You can play with Shirou later after school. You're late enough for school as it is. Ack! The girl screamed as she looked at her watch to check the time. I'm screwed if I'm ridiculously late again. Immediately letting go of the boy and dashing out of the house, not breaking step to grab her book bag in the process. I'll see you guys for dinner. She yelled from the doorway before her footsteps quickly disappeared. The two remaining males sighed as they finished their meal, grateful for the peace and quiet they got for now. You know she's going to collapse from a cramp and be even later now, right? Shirou asked after a few minutes of content eating. I won't say anything to her about it later if you don't. Kiritsugu stated casually before finishing his meal. Oh. That night Kiritsugu and Shirou were once again in their shack, which Shirou had chosen to be his workshop, the core of his research as a magus. Kiritsugu was fairly certain that if any high-ranking magus had actually seen the state and location of the boy's center of operations, filled with random mechanical rubbish and no magical appliances, they would either laugh their asses off and pass the whole thing off as some sort of joke, or more realistically kill him, the boy, and then torch the place down in order to make them repent to the insult they had inadvertently done to all of those who practiced thaumaturgy. Still, the shack served its purpose well, as once more Shirou started off the night analyzing over a dozen random objects inside and telling his father what he knew of the object and what was wrong if it didn't work, carefully going over each and every detail as he did so. Since Shirou actually knew what the hell he was doing now, he could actually trace more than at most 3 objects in a session without keeling over, and because of that they were making great progress. "Alright, Shirou." Kiritsugu nodded, pleased with the boy's dedication to his practice. "Now that we are done with your foundation training, I am going to teach you a bit about bounded fields." "You mean like that magic security system you have set up around the house?" The boy tilted his head to the side curiously. He was a bit winded from his training so far, however his somewhat large number of now activated magic circuits had quickly replenished his energy. Kiritsugu nodded. "Correct. A bounded field is a topographic type of magecraft, or in layman's terms a long-term spell spread over a given area. To make one you have to in a sense knit a network of prana and spread it on base area, such as a piece of land or a building, to create a mystic boundary line that separates the inside from the outside. The clearly advanced ones cover literal spaces, be it in mid-air or underground, however that is something beyond what I can teach you." He scratched his head sheepishly. "Like you know, I'm unable to use much magic anymore, however I was rather good at setting up and especially good at tearing down fields. The one around the house for example is almost impossible to detect even by strong mages since it does not attack or defend, but simply informs us of when someone with ill intentions comes inside. This includes humans and non-humans, which is somewhat rare for bounded fields." Shirou's eyes however did not seem disappointed in the man in the slightest. "Cool. I knew you were awesome at this stuff." "Right." Kiritsugu laughed nervously, knowing that all he was teaching the boy was stuff he could only remember since he had barely any magic textbooks on hand. Anyways, bounded fields are what pretty much every magi use to protect their workshop. There are 2 ways to make an effective defense against a workshop. The first is to make the fields you construct so subtle that the invading magi won't detect them and their effects until it is too late, and the other is to make the field so overwhelmingly strong that they can overwhelm any offense that the enemy can think of. He smirked lazily. "I have a different approach in using and looking at magic compared to other magi, so I was pretty good at finding the weaknesses in strong fields. I once broke through a very strong set of fields around one noble's homes in about 3 hours. According to my guesses, it would take even a strong magus to do the same about a year." He was somewhat embarrassed and ashamed that the boy looking at him in awe since he was pretty much bragging about how well he was a mystical breaking and entering. He prayed that this wouldn't leave the kid with ideas in the future. "So then." He coughed and getting back to his lesson. "Once made, the boundary line will limit the range of the powers of the bounded field, but it is possible to set magic sigils across the inside of the field to expand the area of effect, strengthen it, and do other things. A magus can erase the sigils of course as long as they know what they are doing. As for the boundaries themselves by interrupting and removing the prana fueling it, so long as you know that the field is there and that you have the know-how and prana yourself to do so. Some of the stronger fields are nearly impossible to destroy alone since they require certain methods to do so, or they rely on a nearby prana battery to support it." Kiritsugu paused for a moment as he saw Shirou blinking at him. It was at this point that he remembered that he was talking to a 10-year-old. He might have accidentally overwhelmed the kid with all the technical talk. "So, basically," the boy said slowly, "you draw a shape with magic, and depending on the spell and how much prana you put in it you get different strengths and effects." He began to put the lecture into his own words. "Then you can make the field better with those rune things, but the runes and the field can be removed by a guy who knows what they are doing, and they will most likely get rid of the runes first because it makes things easier." Kiritsugu nodded. "Yeah. The guys at the clock tower would use more complicated words, but that's the gist of it. He sat down casually. For now though, let's get back to your training. First you have to learn how to make the lines to shape your bounded fields. Now close your mind and access your circuit. Most fields are rather big, but for now we are just going to focus on making a small circle around the both of us. It had been 2 months now and Kiritsugu was fairly certain he had more than enough information on the future war to start preparing for specifics now. He was aware of the identity of every master and every servant fighting in the war. Their powers, strengths, weaknesses, noble phantasms, personalities, desires, everything was written down in his notebook with as much detail as he could. He had no doubt that some things would change from how they were now. The war could start at an earlier or later date for some reason. Different masters or servants could be participating. He had though a list of things that would be present in this current war though. Shirou would for certain summon Arturia again. The boy possessed Avalon, the sheath of Excalibur inside his body after all. The Grail was not a living being and had no consciousness, but with the constant presence of a potential master and a strong catalyst such as this there was no mistaking this would pass. The master for the Tosaka family would obviously be the daughter of Archer's original master, seeing as she was the only one in her family with the name and the ability left. Who she would summon on the other hand was now up in the air though, as Kiritsugu's training of Shirou would have no doubt complicated things on that end. However, should the heroic spirit Emiya be summoned once more, he should prepare something just in case for that. The master for the Mato family would likewise be the sister of Rin, the adopted girl Sakura, whose body was flooded with crest worms and her mind and body being corrupted and defiled by the remains of the previous Holy Grail. The girl was the definition of a wild card at this stage, posing as a great threat or ally either way, especially with Zoken still surviving somehow. His best bet was to nudge the boy into archery club in middle school since from the dreams they both attended it, and likewise push him in her direction with a few suggestions afterwards should he still be alive at the time. Still, she was a difficult card to guide, maneuver, or control. The master of the third of the great families that created the ritual would be his daughter, Iliasevil von Einsborn. The thought of which both flooded him with dread and joy due to the fact that putting the girl into such a situation that would most likely kill her was also the best bet he had at separating her from the oppressive magus family in the first place. He had no doubt in his mind as well that her partner would be the berserker of the war in the form of the legendary Heracles as well. The Einsborn family was always very thorough in their attempts in obtaining strong servants by finding the appropriate catalysts to summon them through. He could attest to that firsthand when the family had delivered to him the actual long-lost scabbard of Excalibur itself so he could summon King Arturia as Saber. It was a shame he had seen what the fate of the monster had become in each of the 3 scenarios. He truly was the mightiest of servants in this war alone even if his mind was no longer present. Then there was Kotomine. Kiritsugu had no doubt that the despicable priest would somehow make himself a part of the wars in one way or another and force himself to be the master of one of the other servants, secretly manipulating things from behind the scenes. The Golden King of Heroes was not much better, flaunting his power as soon as he saw it appropriate. Kiritsugu knew that making a move against either one of the two before the war was the equivalent to suicide. Even if he had a sniper rifle and a clear view of the church. The man had no doubt that the priest would either be protected by some church-devised bounded field or by the servant himself. Speaking of the uncertainties however, there were more than a few that had him unnerved to a degree. The first of which was the identity of Archer in this oncoming war. Having the future version of his son would be an immense boon to his efforts, but even then the man would most likely try to kill Shirou in an attempt to create a paradox and not be a counter-guardian anymore. If another Archer appeared, well Shirou would just have to deal with that when it happened. The Mato family in general was another wild factor. Keeping Sakura alive with the possibility of becoming a Dark Grail was a very big risk, one he really didn't like. Zoken was just as bad, being a withered old demon barely in the shape of a human. That did not mean however that he had not prepared plans with them in mind. The identities of the servants Lancer, Caster, Assassin, and even Rider were uncertain to him. He did not know how or who summoned them in particular for the most part, and if different catalysts would be used. For now though he would just have to assume that they indeed were the ones that would eventually be summoned. Kirai and Gilgamesh, well there was more than enough to say about them. Thankfully though, it seems as if Kirai at least seems to want to stay back and watch for the beginning of the war. Kiritsugu had already formulated several plans for the battles, each one depending on certain factors and possible outcomes of steps that occur. Some were more important than others, yet the end result and the main goals would be the same. The Grail War would end. Ilya would be saved. Shirou would not die. As few innocents would die as possible. What happened to the rest of the participants was really up to the heavens and how things turned out. He had given, most of them at least, a chance in his plans to survive, but their survival was up to them in the end. Shirou had been getting the hang of his training for a while now. He had begun to practice his projecting in earnest in addition to his structural grasping training. When Taiga was around the two would practice sparring in the dojo, much to his amusement and the boy's reluctance, and Shirou in the meantime still went out of his way to help others in school without asking for any compensation even though he's only in 5th grade. The base for the boy was there now. So long as he kept in those habits the boy would at least be in satisfactory condition for when the war comes. Kiritsugu had no doubt that should the archer in the war be the boy's future self still, Shirou would no longer take so long to inherit and adapt to the man's memories physically or mentally. Still, that was not enough to ensure victory by a long shot. A few years of slightly specified training for a boy going into his teen years would not protect him significantly from an experienced magus, let alone a heroic spirit. Shirou's abilities would not be able to pose a significant threat unless he laid eyes upon a noble phantasm or at least trained to Project Avalon, and that was still years from now, years the ex-assassin did not have. The boy needed an ace before the fighting even started, and after much thought and planning, and experimenting a small amount with the boy's projection abilities one day a week earlier, Kiritsugu had come up with a solution. "Are you going again?" Shirou moaned as his father closed his bag filled with clothes, notes, and a small wooden box. "Yes." The father smiled gently, knowing why the boy was so downtrodden. He tended to be gone for spans lasting almost a month at a time whenever he left in his attempts to see his daughter again. Unfortunately his efforts were constantly stopped by either the Einsburn's guards or the barriers surrounding the isolated castle that took forever to get to and from. They never bothered to listen to his warning that the Grail was corrupted by the spirit of Ngramenu, the source of all the evil in the world. A small smirk appeared on the man's face. He wondered if they still had that computer he had set up in the middle of their cathedral still. He remembered how irritated he had made the elder of the family, bugging him about how it would increase his chances of victory in the Fourth War if he had it until he had finally given in. Odds were that it was utterly destroyed upon word that he had betrayed them. Oh well, these newer models were much better than the one there anyways. "Is it the same place as always?" the boy asked with a sigh, already resigning himself to the fact that his dad would most likely be gone for a long period of time again, even though Kiritsugu never actually told Shirou where he went in the first place. "No." The father shook his head. "I have some business I have to take care of elsewhere this time. I should still be gone for a while, but not nearly as long as I normally do. Be good and keep Taiga-chan out of trouble." He patted the boy gently on his head, knowing exactly what he had just said. "Keep to your studies and your routine. Don't try any difficult magic while I'm gone other than your projection, small bounded fields, and reinforcing objects. If you can show me some improvements when I get back, I'll start to teach you how to reinforce your body." Shirou's eyes widened in awe and excitement. Reinforcing a living body was exceptionally difficult and dangerous for most magi to do, though doing so properly had some very interesting results including but not limited to enhanced strength, speed, and sight. It was one of the first things the boy wanted to try to do when he learned about the particular field, and as such it was of course one of the first things the man had forbidden the boy from doing. Really? He asked excitedly, no doubt wondering about all the things he could do to secretly help people once he learned the art. The man nodded with a kind face. Yeah, but you have to show me how much you've improved, and not die, when I come home. Ah, the life of a magus. Your research was so likely to kill you at times that at times it truly was difficult to tell if one was joking about such things. The boy nodded with vigor. Yeah. Just you watch. I'm gonna project something awesome for you when you get back. And it will work too. He looked at his dad with conviction. Well then I better make sure to have something else good to teach you as well when I get back, or else I might run out of things to teach you. Kiritsugu laughed as he began to walk out of the house. Stay safe, Shirou. I will. The boy responded from the door. Where are you going anyways? The magus killer had half a mind to leave the location of his trip a secret, however in the end he decided to tell the boy anyways. Unlike the Einsburns castle, Shirou might actually go there at one point in the future when all this was behind him. England. Was all he said before closing the door behind him. That is the end of the chapters for today. The name and author for this fanfic will be in the description down below if you want to read it yourself. See you tomorrow, peace.